Good afternoon. I cannot speak in Kannada. I know 5 languages, none of which is Kannada, sadly. So I'm going to have to make do with English. And I'm very glad to be here. And I was very fortunate enough to have read a decently translated book of Naveen's in English, which I absolutely enjoyed. It was a very thoroughly researched book. And what's even more important is the fact that it is in Kannada. You know, this is something that I wrote about last year as well for a news publication, where I stressed that one of the main reasons as to why there is so much of communalization of history which is happening today. Why is that so easy? It's because good academic history is still in the shackles of English language. And it's very important to free that. So what Naveen is doing is very important. To write in the language of the people, which the people can understand. Because that is how I personally believe would be a very powerful way to actually counter the Sanghi propaganda, the RSS propaganda, which is very rampant today. And it is all sorts of factless gibberish which is floated around masquerading as history, lots of WhatsApp forwards, etc. But they managed to do this in the language of the people. Every place, in every language will have some one resident welfare association group where some uncle will be floating a WhatsApp forward which talks about how many temples were demolished by the Mughals or how many forced conversions happened under the sultans. So I think what Naveen therefore is doing is very important. And I would actually encourage as many people who can create this fantastic balance of writing in the language of the people, but also writing a thoroughly researched history. That's equally important. And that is quite a feat considering Naveen does not have a qualification in history. To be able to do a thorough research on Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali, therefore, is a remarkable thing. And now I want to actually also talk about Tipu Sultan himself and just basically address a couple of the myths that have been floating around. One, of course, is the idea of forced conversions. Now, as many sources as I have read, there are 2 kinds of narratives that come across. One, of course, is the narrative that Tipu used forced conversions as a state policy, which is that whenever he wanted to punish somebody, he would forcibly convert them. Or there was a lot of brutality. And I therefore want to sort of bring in the example of, and this is going to be from Malabar because I think that's where the most interesting example comes from, is the example of the Moplas, right? The Mapilas as they're called. Now the Mopilas, of course, a lot of them were converted, but they were not converted by force. A lot of them were people who were from either the Cherumar caste, who was again a low caste, and therefore felt that converting to Islam, joining the Mopila community, would give them a decent amount of equality that they wanted in the society. So a lot of them converted. A lot of them also converted because it became easier for them to get hired by the Mopilas who had become, by the 18th century, agriculturalists. So economic incentives as well. But it's equally important to note that you cannot completely dismiss the fact that when Tipu Sultan comes to Malabar, that forced conversions don't happen, they do happen. And I'll come to why. But what is equally important is that for the first time in Malabar, even the Moplas are taxed. The land taxation before that would allow them to not be taxed as their customary right. Only the peasant was taxed. Under Tipu's reign, the peasant was the only one who was not taxed, interestingly. And the Moplas were the one who had to pay tax out of their own pocket. Which is why the Moplas started resenting Tipu Sultan. Initially, they were very pro the Mysorean government, which had come to be established in Malabar. But eventually, they became anti-Tipu Sultan. So Tipu was pretty ruthless with the Moplas as well. But like I said, you cannot rule out the fact that there were some forced conversions that were certainly carried out. Now, why was that happening? Why was he ruthless in crushing the Moplas who were rebelling against him? And why is he carrying out forced conversions of these Hindus? One of the main reasons is because the problem with popular history today is that it starts looking for angels and demons and kings. It's very important to contextualize monarchy. Monarchy is based on the use of ruthless force. You don't use ruthless force, you are dead as a king, literally. Some other king will come, use ruthless force against you, use ruthless force against your loyalists, and become the next king. So force and coercion is the mainstay of any ruler, which is why I think it's very important that whoever the ruler is, when you're talking about a ruler in history, a monarch in history, it's important to analyze them as a monarch. No matter how much you like him, no matter how much you hate them, it's very important to contextualize in the fact that kings at that point of time did have a set of ruthless policies that they followed to keep their subjects and to keep their enemies in check. But because Tipu did some forced conversions, there are many myths that have come about, which academic historians have been debunking for at least half a century now. And one of the most important myths that they have been debunking is this myth that comes about that because he was converting so many Brahmins, 3,000 Brahmins committed suicide. No, they don't. They didn't. In fact, I would say the Brahmins were probably the least who were affected by the forced conversions. And this aligns with if you look at the history of the Brahmins in general. Since Sudeep had sort of brought this point, and I want to rescue Tipu from this idea that he was somehow paying a lip service to the Brahmins, he was just following the policy of every ruler before him. Every ruler, no matter what their caste, has paid a lip service to the Brahmins because they recognize very quickly that these are the people who are at the top of the social hierarchy. You make friends with them, your legitimacy is going to flow easily. So while coercion is important for a monarchy to exist, for it to exist for a long period of time, soft power is equally important. Where does that soft power comes from? From social legitimacy. Where will that social legitimacy come from? By being friends with the people who can grant you that social legitimacy. So for example, this is centuries and centuries before Tipu, you had a group of people called the Kushans. Now these are people who are technically described as, this is a very terrible term, which is described for outcasts called Mlech, barbarians. Because they come from outside the subcontinent, right? From China. The tribe is called Yuchi. But it's fascinating that within 5 to 10 years of them coming to the subcontinent, in the Afghanistan, Pakistan, this northwestern region of India, they managed to earn the title of Devaputra, which is the son of a god himself. So from being Mlech, they graduated to becoming Devaputra. How did they manage this? The Brahmins, correct. They became friendly with the Brahmins. They gave land grants to the Brahmins, tax-free land grants. So a lot of the oppression on the peasant, in fact, was less to do with the king and more to do with the Brahmin, because The Brahmin is not going to pay tax to the king. He has a tax-free land grant. He is free to oppress the peasant as much as he wants to. I think it's very, very important to remember. So Tipu therefore is following a policy that all rulers before him have. This is going to make him earn legitimacy. He is in fact very careful, and this is very much written about in sources, but because there is a propaganda happening today, most people don't like to discuss about the fact that he was very considerate towards his Hindu population. He is making sure that they have enough room to follow their religion the way they want to. So if he is forced converting a section of people, these are usually prisoners of war, right? It is also somewhere down the line a response to what the British are doing at that point of time as well. The British are carrying out a lot of conversions to Christianity. And we know this for a fact that Tipu and Hyder were both very influenced by the English in the sense that they knew these are powerful people. So it's very important to understand how they maintain their power. So one is of course technology, which fascinated both Tipu more so than Hyder. The other of course is the fact that, what are the ways in which they are exercising control. The other thing that I want to touch upon with respect to Tipu is of course the fact, this particular incident that I think is very, very important to discuss, is the sacking of the Sringeri Mutt, which happens in between 1790-1792 by a group of the Marathas called Raghunath Rao Patwardhan. Raghunath Rao Patwardhan's forces during the Third Anglo-Mysore War go and completely raid Sringeri Mutt. The raid let them have 60 lakh rupees of loot. This is no joke. It's a huge money at that point of time. 18th century, 60 lakh rupees. Must be roughly about 6 crore rupees today. Probably more. The conservative estimate. So they earned so much. And then of course, the person who was in charge of the Sringeri Mutt, Sachidanand Bharti, writes a letter to Parshuram Bhau, who is the Maratha ruler at that point of time, saying, this has happened. This is outrageous. How can you loot the Mutt? And I would request you to bring all of that money back, whatever you've looted from us. And he says, you've not only looted from us, you've also destroyed the shrine of Shardamba, which is Saraswati. You've also broken the idol of Shardamba. So he is given an assurance that, he'll be returned these items, but we hear nothing from them further on. Who is the person who makes sure that the money gets to the Sringeri Mutt? It's Tipu Sultan. Tipu Sultan writes a letter saying that he's horrified this has happened and that he's giving 400 rahatis. Rahati was a kind of a coin. Tipu had very eclectic names for his coins, and a lot of the times the coins denoted the function that they were to perform. So rahati was a kind of coin which would give relief, which was given in relief measures. So the relief measure was 400 rahatis given, and he said that with this money you can reinstall a new idol of Shardamba and you can create a new shrine for Shardamba. And also, I would like you to pray for the reign, my reign, Tipu's reign. Because at that point of time, he's facing a lot of enemies. You have the Anglo-Mysore wars, especially on the third one. You had the Marathas, the Nizam of Hyderabad, as well as the British on one side. And then you had the Mysorean government on the other. So they're very cornered. So he absolutely needs whatever prayers he can get. So it's fascinating to see how Tipu is able to understand, firstly, that his population is diverse and therefore their needs are diverse. And therefore, if he is extending relief measures to X population, he will extend relief measures to Y population as well. But at the same point of time, it is also a very wise thing for him to do as a king. There's a quid pro quo as well. Right? Sachidanand Bharti is a very important person. He's the head of the Sringeri Mutt. Being in his good books will help Tipu Sultan. Right? And lastly, and I think this is very important, when we talk about the fact that how is Tipu Sultan treating the Hindus, it's very important to realize that this identity at that point of time does not exist the way it exists today. The term Hindu in itself, which denotes non-Christians and non-Muslims, it's a negative definition which is given by the British. They are the first to coin this term for all non-Christians and non-Muslims in the subcontinent. And this is a very problematic definition for many reasons. Firstly, because it's an exclusionary definition, it's not an inclusionary definition. Secondly, it then by no means should be including what it does include: Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs. These are all separate religions. Buddhism and Jainism, in fact, came as an opposition to Vedic Hinduism at one point of time. So that identity does not exist during Tipu's time at all. So who are these Hindus that he should cater to? They are very different. They are either Shaivites, they are Vaishnavites, they are divided on castes, they are divided on different sects. So therefore, it's also important to think of this, that when we say that, he was either favoring the Muslims and he was against Hindus, or he was favoring the Hindus and he was against Muslims, it's important to know that this binary does not exist at that point of time. And has never existed before the British made sure that this becomes a very straight-jacketed boundary. And I want to sort of end with that as well, that every time we use terms in history, it's very important to understand where that term comes from. For example, where the term Hindu comes from, where the term Muslim comes from. Was it used at that point of time? Was religion understood like the way it is understood today? No, very different. Right? So for example, 7th century, 8th century, a Shaivite and a Vaishnavite would not like each other. A Shaivite and a Vaishnavite would not like the Buddhists. The Buddhists would not like the Jains. If you would tell them you're all from the same religion, they would slap you. So therefore, it's very important to remember that you cannot use terms when it comes to history without qualifying them. And secondly, we should stop looking at kings as either angels or demons. They are a grey character. They use force. It's something that all kings have used. Whatever their religious affiliation would be, doesn't matter. And almost all kings, I think this is very important, have managed to realize that they rule over a diverse population. And it is in their interest to keep patronizing as much of the diversity as possible. And Tipu is no exception to that fact. He did exactly that. Thank you.